The gravel of the lane was white with frost, and it was the cold she felt first, not the shame. She had been given exactly the time it took Lady Dorothea to speak 3 sentences. The first sentence told her she had no legal claim to remain at Ashby Park. The second told her that a room had been prepared for her at the coaching inn at Wentbridge, and that the innkeeper had been paid for 1 week. The third sentence was delivered with the front door already partially closed, the gap narrowing as Lady Dorothea's voice finished its work. The words were very clear, very composed, and they did not waver. Because Lady Dorothea had spent 3 years practicing the management of Eleanor, and she had become exceedingly good at it. The door shut, the latch fell. Eleanor stood in the lane. She had her cloak. She had the small leather case she had packed in the quarter hour she was allowed upstairs. She had her father's pocket Bible, which she had pressed into the case at the last moment because it was the one thing she was certain Lady Dorothea would sell. She did not have shoes. She had come down in her stockings when summoned to the drawing room, expecting a conversation, and the conversation had ended before she could return upstairs for them. The lane was paved with loose gravel that had been white since the week before Christmas, and it pressed through her stockings with the patient indifference of things that do not mean any harm, and cause it regardless. It was the 15th of January. The year was 1817. Eleanor Ashby, 22 years of age and the only surviving child of Sir William Ashby, stood without shoes in the frost at the end of the lane that led from the house her father had built and placed her mother's portrait above the door of, and loved for 31 years. And she understood, with the peculiar clarity that extreme cold sometimes produces, that she had nowhere to go. A carriage came around the bend from the direction of Wentbridge at an ordinary pace. A well-maintained vehicle with a crest on the door she did not recognize. It slowed. Not for the reason she feared. Not for that particular quality of slowing she had learned to dread in men on the road. It slowed because the man at the window had seen her and had directed his driver to stop, and the quality of his attention, when he appeared in the open window, was not that kind. He was perhaps 30, dark-haired, in a coat that suggested London and a face that suggested nothing. She could read quickly. His eyes moved from her face to her feet and back, once without commentary. "The coaching inn at Wentbridge," he said. "I pass directly through it if you will accept." Eleanor looked at him. She had learned to be very careful about the offers of strangers, and she was also standing in her stockings in January, and her feet had stopped feeling the gravel and begun to feel something worse, which was nothing at all. "Thank you," she said. She did not give her name. He did not ask for it. She rode to Wentbridge in the corner of his carriage, with her leather case on her lap and her feet pulled up slightly from the floor because the floor was cold too, and the man sat across from her and read his dispatches and did not look at her again except once, at the coaching inn, when he handed her down from the step, and his hand closed over hers. Briefly and entirely without pressure, the lightest possible grip, the kind a man uses when he understands that the person he is steadying does not want to be held. She did not learn his name until much later. She did not think about him much in the months that followed, because thinking about any kindness was a kind of danger she had learned not to court. She had 3 shillings and 4 pence in her possession. She had a week's lodging paid for. She had 1 change of linen, her father's Bible, a half-finished pair of gloves. She had been making herself, because there was no money for new ones, and a pair of embroidered silk slippers that had belonged to her mother, which she had not been able to fit into the leather case, and had left on the windowsill of her room, in the hope that Mrs. Cadder, Penny the housekeeper, would keep them for her. Those slippers were the last thing she thought of, lying in the cold bed at the Wentbridge Inn that first night before she slept. She had not always been in the position of counting shillings in a coaching inn. That was what was strange, and also what was not strange at all, because the position had arrived by such gradual degrees that it was difficult now to name the moment at which it became inevitable. Her father, Sir William, had died in the spring of 1815. He had been ill for 2 winters, a slow and dignified diminishment that he bore, with the quiet stubbornness that had characterized most of his decisions, including the one he had made in his 58th year to marry Lady Dorothea Caldwell. a widow of good family and considerable determination who had arrived in the country 3 winters before his death and had managed, with a degree of skill Eleanor could only recognize in retrospect, to make herself necessary to a man who was tired and lonely and far too generous to suspect anyone of calculation. Eleanor had been 19 when her father married. Lady Dorothea, she had been genuinely glad for him. She had been, she could admit now, also naive. Sir William had assumed his estate would pass to Eleanor, and that his wife would be provided for by a generous jointure. He had not anticipated that his wife's solicitors, who were considerably more practiced than his own, would identify a technical irregularity in the will's execution that allowed Lady Dorothea to contest the disposition of the house and grounds. The irregularity was real. It was also extremely small. It was the kind of irregularity that between reasonable parties with goodwill on both sides might have been settled in an afternoon. Lady Dorothea's solicitors were not reasonable in that particular way, and the settlement had dragged for 2 years while Eleanor lived in her own father's house as something between a guest and a servant. The library had been the first room she was asked to vacate because Lady Dorothea's niece, Miss Cecily Fordham, required it as a private sitting room when she came to visit, which was frequently and for increasingly extended stays. Then the morning room had been absorbed into Lady Dorothea's own management. Eleanor's meals were taken alone. The invitations that arrived at the house addressed to Miss Ashby were invariably intercepted and returned with regrets. She had become, in her own home, invisible. She had understood the arrangement better than she acknowledged it. Even to herself, Lady Dorothea was building something. She was building a position for Miss Fordham, who was 23 and very pretty, and had £30,000, and who Lady Dorothea intended to marry to a specific gentleman of property in the neighborhood. A match that would benefit Lady Dorothea financially in ways Eleanor had not fully mapped, but could feel. The way you can feel the shape of a wall in the dark without touching it. Eleanor's continued presence complicated the presentation. The daughter of the house, the legitimate heir, sitting at the table, was an inconvenient reminder of a claim that the law had not quite finished extinguishing. The dismissal had been coming. Eleanor had known it the way you know a window will not hold much longer, the way you feel the draft before the glass breaks. She had simply not anticipated the frost. Bath was what she arrived at, after Wentbridge, because it was the most practical destination available to a young woman with 3 shillings and a recently concluded week's lodging, and because she had a distant connection there, a widow, the wife of one of her father's old acquaintances, a Mrs. Bennet. Clement, who had once written to Eleanor's mother with warmth, and who, when Eleanor wrote, now responded with the information that she required a companion, and that the terms were modest but the room was dry, and the work was not disagreeable. It was not disagreeable. Mrs. Clement was 71, and almost entirely deaf, and liked to be read to from 3 in the afternoon until 5, and then again after supper, and she had a good library and a kind cook who gave Eleanor her meals at the same table and treated her with the unaffected dignity that good servants always offered the quietly reduced. Eleanor was grateful for the library. She read to Mrs. Clement for 2 hours every afternoon and spent the mornings writing letters. She could not quite bring herself to send letters to the family solicitor, Sir Thomas Greer, who had represented her father's interests and who she suspected might still have something useful to say about the technical irregularity if she could afford to retain him. She could not afford to retain him. She wrote the letters anyway and kept them in a bundle at the bottom of her case. Bath was not unkind to her. It was simply indifferent, which was something she was already well practiced at sustaining. It was at a small evening gathering in March, 3 months after her expulsion, that she first encountered Mrs. Alice Paget and Mrs. Paget first encountered Eleanor, though both of them understood the significance of that encounter differently, and at different times the gathering was hosted by a Mrs. Finch, a sociable woman of modest consequence, who enjoyed assembling mixed groups of Bath visitors on the grounds that interesting conversation required variety. There was a colonel who had served in the Peninsula. There was a clergyman from Bristol who wrote pamphlets. There was a party from the royal household passing through Bath on their way north, which included Mrs. Paget, a lady of middle years, whose manner suggested long practice in composure, and the elderly Mrs. Agatha Price, who was attached to the royal household in some capacity of long standing that no one ever quite specified, and who was 80 years old and losing her sight. Mrs. Price had been positioned near a window with a book, which was a kind gesture and also a useless one, because the light was failing, and her eyes were failing faster. The fashionable guests moved past her with the smooth indifference of people who have learned to arrange other people in rooms, and then leave them there. Eleanor, crossing to retrieve a book, Mrs. Marchta. Clement had asked her to borrow, noticed the old woman's hands on the closed cover of the book, the stillness of them, the particular quality of stillness that belongs to someone who has given up asking for what they need. She sat down next to Mrs. Price without asking permission, and opened the book and began to read from where Mrs. Price's ribbon marked the page. She read for 40 minutes. She read steadily, without drama, in the clear, unhurried voice she used for Mrs. Clement, giving each sentence its proper weight without flourish. Mrs. Price did not look at her. She simply listened, her hands loosening on her lap, and when Eleanor reached the end of a chapter and paused to ask if she should continue, the old woman said yes, in a voice that meant she had been waiting for someone to ask. It was not a dramatic act, it was a quiet one, the kind of act that requires no courage, because it is simply the right thing, and the person doing it does not think of it as anything. Beyond that, Eleanor thought of it as nothing beyond that. Mrs. Paget, who had been watching from across the room with the attentiveness of a woman trained to notice what rooms contain, thought of it differently. The first voicing of the label came the following week, in a form Eleanor had learned to expect. A Bath acquaintance of Lady Dorothea's attended a morning call at Mrs. Clement's, and when Eleanor left the room to order tea, the acquaintance said to Mrs. Clement, loudly enough to carry through the inadequately closed door, that she had heard from Lady Ashby that the turned-out girl had found her level at last. She said it with a particular note of satisfaction, the note of someone delivering a verdict they have been carrying and are glad to set down. Eleanor brought the tea in and served it, and did not change her expression. She had become very good at not changing her expression. It was one of the skills Lady Dorothea's management had given her without intending to. Mrs. Paget called on Eleanor 4 days later. She presented herself at Mrs. Missett Clement's door at 11 in the morning alone, with a card that bore a household cipher Eleanor did not immediately recognize. "I have a proposal," Mrs. Paget said when they were seated. "It is not charity. I want to be plain about that before I offer it." Eleanor, who was also good at silence, waited. "My household requires a reader and a correspondent," Mrs. Paget said. "The salary is not large, but it is better than what you are receiving here. The work requires travel to London within the month. I understand you may have reasons to remain in Bath, and if so, I will not press. If not, I would like to know your answer by Thursday." Eleanor considered the reasons she might have to remain in Bath. They amounted to 1 room, a deaf widow who had been kind to her, a borrowed library, and the bundle of unsent letters in her case. "You may have my answer now," Eleanor said. Mrs. Paget's salary was indeed better than what Mrs. Matter Clement had offered, and the room in the London house was warm and faced a garden and had a window that let in the particular quality of spring light that Eleanor had not known she missed until she saw it again. She unpacked her leather case in 20 minutes. She tucked the bundle of unsent letters into the drawer of the writing table. She put her father's Bible on the shelf. She went downstairs to learn the shape of the work. The work was real work. Mrs. Paget managed correspondence for a household whose obligations were numerous and whose time was limited, and Eleanor's capacity for clear, careful prose made her genuinely useful. She wrote letters. She organized papers. She attended events where her function was to be quietly competent and make the people around her feel that everything was proceeding smoothly. She had been trained for exactly this kind of labor in the 3 years of her stepmother's management, and she did it now without bitterness, because the alternative to doing it well was not available to her. And she had inherited her father's practicality along with his library. She had been in London 6 weeks when she first attended the kind of formal gathering where she might be expected to see Lord Wyndham. If you are wondering whether this is a good time to leave a comment on what you think of Eleanor, I can tell you that I understand the impulse. She was the sort of woman who made other women feel they had perhaps been too hasty in their own surrenders. Stay with her a little longer. She did not know who he was the first time she encountered him at a function in Mrs. Paget's household, because Mrs. Paget did not perform introductions the way Bath hostesses did. Eleanor simply registered a tall man in court dress, dark-haired, standing near the door in the particular way that suggests someone who is present out of obligation rather than preference. She noted him the way she noted all the people in any room she entered now, categorized, assessed for relevance, filed. It was Mrs. Paget's young ward, a girl of 9 named Harriet, who made the encounter matter. Harriet was not meant to be at the function. She had wandered down from the nursery in her nightgown, drawn by the sound of voices, and had got as far as the drawing-room doorway before her slipper caught the edge of the carpet, and she fell hard in the open door of the room where 30 people were assembled. The sharp crack of her knee on the parquet was audible, so was the silence that followed, and so was the more delicate social machinery of a roomful of people deciding how to respond to something that required someone to act. Eleanor crossed the room. She did not run, which would have caused its own kind of disruption, but she moved with a purpose that suggested she was not waiting for anyone's permission. She knelt in her blue evening gown, which was not new, and which she had been careful with, and she gathered Harriet up with the practiced ease of someone who has carried a child before and knows which arms to put where. She spoke to the child quietly, checked the knee, found it bruised but unbroken, and held her for the moment of crying that followed, without comment, without the kind of excessive maternal performance that would have made Harriet self-conscious. Then she rose, still holding her, and carried her out of the room. She was not thinking about how she looked. She was thinking about the child's knee and the carpet's edge, and whether the staircase was warm enough. Lord Marcus Wyndham, Viscount Wyndham, standing near the door, watched every second of it. He had a specific and practiced skill for remaining still in rooms, and he used it now to conceal the fact that he had recognized her the moment she walked in. He had known her. He had known her since January, since the frost road outside Ashby Park, since the particular quality of her grip on the carriage door that said she was grateful, and was also angry at needing to be grateful, and was going to manage both of those things with the same face she always used in public. He had thought about her, in the months since, more than he had expected to, with the particular quality of unease that comes from having seen something clearly and not been able to do anything about what you saw. He had not introduced himself to her at the function. There had not been an appropriate moment, and he understood that an inappropriate approach would be worse than no approach at all. He found the approach over the next 3 weeks by being very patient about it. He asked Mrs. Paget, at a subsequent occasion, whether her reader might recommend a bookseller on Cheapside that he had heard well of. He had not heard of any bookseller on Cheapside. Eleanor, when the question reached her, supplied the name of 3, because she did know Cheapside. Because she had been careful about her small salary and had found it could be stretched considerably if one knew where to go. He thanked her for the recommendations, in a note that was entirely proper, entirely impersonal, and contained the name of a title she might find of interest, in the specific section of his note that was not about Cheapside, and was therefore the whole point of the note. She found the title of interest. She sent a reply that addressed the Cheapside question with precision, and the other question obliquely, because she was not certain yet what the other question was. He delivered a message to Mrs. Paget's house one afternoon that a footman could have carried. He delivered it personally and encountered Eleanor in the passage and said, his voice level, that he had found the book she had recommended to be very much as she had described it. "I thought it might be so," Eleanor said. "Miss Ashby," he said. He said it with the quality of someone choosing to use a name they have been waiting to use. "I believe you were in Bath in February." She looked at him. She was not the kind of woman who dissembled when directness would do. "I was at Mrs. Finch's gathering," he said. "I heard of it afterward from Mrs. Price." She had not known Mrs. Price knew her name. She had not given it. Price asked Mrs. Paget to find out who had read to her. Marcus said. Mrs. Paget found out I was present when she was told. He paused. The way he paused when he was being very careful about something. I do not believe you know that I was in the lane outside Ashby Park in January. Eleanor was quiet for a moment that lasted longer than it had to. I was not certain, she said. The light was very poor. It was, he said. The frost. She looked at his face, which was a composed face in the way that stone is composed, the way a surface is composed that has not been carved lately and is closed around whatever was cut into it. She understood that there was something under the stone. She also understood that she had no particular right to it, and that a year ago she would not have thought about this distinction, and that the year had changed certain things she had not noticed changing. "Thank you," she said. She meant the carriage. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Walk with me tomorrow, in the square. Mrs. Paget will accompany us if you prefer." She went without Mrs. Baz. Paget, which was a small active choice she barely recognized as choice, until it was made. He was easy to walk with, not in the sense that his company required nothing of her because it required a great deal, but in the sense that what it required was the same quality of honesty she gave to everything, and had been told for 3 years was too much. He asked her about her father. She told him. He listened with the specific quality of listening that means the person has not already decided what they will say next. She asked him once, on a later walk, why he kept his post in the royal household so relentlessly. It was an oblique question, and she framed it carefully, but she meant it honestly, and he knew she did. He was quiet for several seconds. Then he said, "I had a wife. She died." He stopped. He did not offer more, and Eleanor did not press, because she could hear, in the 3 words, the shape of something much larger, that he was choosing not to carry into the afternoon, and she respected that choice in the way she hoped other people would respect hers. She thought about it afterward. She thought about what it cost a man to be that. Still, she thought about the specific texture of loss that makes a person take on more and more duty as though the weight of obligation might fill the space that the other thing has left. She did not let herself think about it for very long. She had learned to be careful about following that particular path. The letter from Lady Dorothea arrived on the 23rd of May. It came via a solicitor's clerk, a young man who presented himself at the house and asked to speak with Eleanor privately. Mrs. Paget was out. Eleanor received him in the small sitting room. He had a letter sealed in a yellow envelope, and a second document unfolded, which he held in his hand with the manner of a man who has been instructed to read from it aloud if required. The yellow letter was from Lady Dorothea herself. It was very short. It said that Eleanor's continued correspondence with Sir Thomas Greer regarding the disposition of Ashby Park had come to Lady Dorothea's attention, and that if Eleanor intended to pursue any legal claim against the settled arrangement, Lady Dorothea had prepared a full account of the circumstances of Eleanor's departure from Ashby Park in January, which she was prepared to submit to a periodical of wide circulation. The account, Lady Dorothea wrote, would describe Eleanor's departure as entirely voluntary, the result of ungovernable temper and refusal to accept the judgment of lawfully established authority. Eleanor put the letter down. She looked at the clerk. And the second document? She said. He unfolded it. He began to read. It was the draft account. It used the phrase "the turned-out girl" 3 times in the first paragraph, each time with the careful quotation marks of someone attributing the phrase to unnamed others, while clearly adopting it themselves. It was a very practiced piece of work. It would ruin the position Eleanor had built over 6 months. It would dismiss whatever small authority her connection to Mrs. Paget's household lent her. It would follow her. These things always followed. Eleanor listened to the draft account read aloud to completion. She thanked the clerk. She saw him to the door. She went to the writing table and opened the drawer, and took out the bundle of letters she had written to the solicitor across 9 months of exile and never sent. She sat for a long time. Then she untied the bundle. She read through the letters, which were detailed and clear, and had been written by a woman who had been furious and frightened, and also very careful not to let either of those things show on the surface of the prose. She selected the 4 that were most specific about the technical irregularity and the circumstances of the will's execution. She sealed them into a fresh envelope. She addressed it to him. Then she wrote him a second letter, separate, which did not hedge and did not apologize, and said plainly that she was ready to pursue the claim, and that she would appreciate at his earliest convenience an appointment to discuss what it would require. She was afraid. She was also done being afraid in the particular way that produces inaction. These were 2 different things, and the year had taught her to tell them apart. She posted the letters herself the following morning. It was Mrs. Paget who came to Eleanor's room 3 weeks later, on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, and told her that a formal presentation had been arranged. The word presentation was precise and carefully chosen, and Eleanor did not allow herself to misread it. Mrs. Paget explained that Mrs. Price had spoken to certain persons, and that those persons had spoken to others, and that the result of this chain of carefully conducted speech was that Eleanor, late of Ashby Park, and currently of Mrs. Paget's household, was to be received in a private audience as a mark of the royal household's regard for the service she had given to an elderly member of its staff at a private gathering in Bath in March. "It's not a grand occasion," Mrs. Paget said. "It is a formal one, I understand," Eleanor said. "You will be offered the use of the court carriage for your return journey," Mrs. Paget said. "This is the form the acknowledgment takes. It is not offered to everyone." Eleanor understood what the court carriage meant, because she had grown up in a house where her father had explained to her the machinery of such things, the language of such gestures, the weight that a particular form of procedural sanction carried in a world that communicated through procedure. It was not a title. It was not an estate. It was something more specific and in some ways more useful. It was a declaration, in the form that declarations took in 1817, that this particular woman had the direct and public regard of the highest household in England. She said, "I will need to write to Sir Thomas." "I have already done so," Mrs. Paget said. "He will meet you at Ashby Park, on the date of your return." Eleanor looked at her. Mrs. Paget had the composed face of a woman who has done something careful, and does not want to be thanked for it, because thanks would introduce sentiment into an arrangement that she preferred to keep procedural. "Thank you," Eleanor said. Anyway, Mrs. Paget said nothing. She did not leave the room immediately, and her hand rested for a moment on Eleanor's shoulder, very briefly, the weight of it as specific and as light as certain kinds of kindness. Marcus found her in the library the evening before her departure. He had known she was going. Mrs. Paget had told him because he had asked, and he had asked because he had learned, in the months of walks and passages and carefully delivered notes, that not asking was its own kind of decision and not always the right one. She was sitting at the writing table with a candle and a letter in her hand. She looked up when he came in and did not ask how he knew to find her there, because she had stopped pretending not to know how well he paid attention. "I have asked Mrs. Paget's permission to ride alongside the coach," he said. He said it the way he said most things, plainly, without ornamentation. "She has granted it. I wanted you to know before tomorrow." Eleanor set the letter down. The candlelight was warm, the kind of light that makes a room smaller and more specific. She could feel his presence with the particular quality of physical awareness that she had spent 6 months pretending she did not experience, and she was very tired of pretending. "Why?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. That was not evasion but consideration, the kind of pause that means the person is choosing precision over speed. "Because I was in the lane in January," he said, "and I was not able to do anything useful then. And I would like to be more useful now." She looked at him. She was aware of her own heartbeat, the way you are aware of your pulse when you have been very still for a long time, and then something shifts. "You have been useful," she said. The bookseller recommendations. The corner of his mouth moved. It was the closest he had come in her presence to something that might have been amusement, and it was, as the book said, such things should be, a significant event. "Eleanor," he said. He said it the way you say a name when you have been waiting to say it, and now that you have said it, you are not certain what to do next. She did not look away. "Tomorrow," she said. "Ride alongside." The coach arrived at Ashby Park at 2 in the afternoon. Eleanor saw the house from a quarter-mile away, the familiar roof line above the elms, the gray stone that she had been looking at all her life and had thought she would never see again from this road. She was sitting very upright in the corner of the court carriage, wearing her best gown, which was dark blue, and had been pressed that morning by Mrs. Paget's maid, and her hands were folded in her lap and her breathing was very controlled. A small cluster of people had gathered at the forecourt by the time the carriage turned through the gates. Household staff. A few tenants from the lane. This was not an accident. Word traveled in the country and the court cipher on the carriage door was visible from some distance. Mrs. Penny stood at the edge of the forecourt steps. She was 60, stout, steady, and she was gripping her apron, with both hands, in the particular way of someone trying to keep their face still. Eleanor heard, as the carriage slowed, the voice of a young housemaid saying something low to another girl beside her. She caught the shape of the phrase without all the words. The turned-out girl, the old language still in circulation. Mrs. Penny turned sharply and said something that silenced both of them. Then she looked back at the carriage, and her face was not still any longer. Lady Dorothea appeared at the top of the stone steps. She was in a morning dress, of deep green, well-tailored, her hair dressed with her customary precision. Beside her stood Miss Cecily Fordham, in pale yellow, her expression carrying the particular uncertainty of someone who has been told what to expect and is finding the reality slightly different. Behind Lady Dorothea, inside the door, was the figure of the solicitor, his hat in his hand. Marcus dismounted from his horse before the carriage had fully stopped. He came around to the door and handed Eleanor down with the same care he had used in January, except that now the grip was not the minimal contact of a stranger being cautious. It was a deliberate, considered pressure. She stood on the gravel of her father's forecourt in her blue gown and her good shoes, and the gravel was cold under the thin soles, but she was wearing shoes, and the cold was the kind of cold that February carries when it is losing its grip, the cold of a thaw rather than a frost. Marcus turned to face the steps. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The forecourt was quiet, the way forecourts go quiet, when something is about to be said that everyone has come to hear. "Miss Ashby returns in the Queen's own coach," he said. "She stays." There was a silence. Lady Dorothea's hand tightened on the stone railing. It was the only thing that moved in her, that tightening, because she was a woman of considerable composure, and she did not lose it in public. The hand tightened, and Eleanor saw it, and Cecily saw it, and Mrs. Penny at the bottom of the steps saw it, and the small group of tenants at the edge of the lane saw it, and the housemaid who had spoken saw it too. Sir Thomas came forward through the open door. He descended the steps with the deliberate pace of a man who has done this kind of work before, and understands that the timing of his movement is itself a communication. "My lady," he said to Lady Dorothea, "I have the document I mentioned in my letter of last Wednesday. The matter of the will's execution has been resolved, and the resolution is in Miss Ashby's favor. I have been in possession of the relevant instrument for some time, awaiting Miss Ashby's formal instruction to proceed." He paused. "She has now given that instruction." Lady Dorothea looked at the document. She did not look at Eleanor. She looked at Sir Thomas, and then at the document, and then at some middle distance that contained nothing useful. "I see," she said. Her voice was level. She had excellent control of her voice. Always. There was no argument. There was no scene. Lady Dorothea was many things, but she was not at her core foolish. And she understood that the court carriage and the gentleman beside it, and the solicitor with the document, had collectively removed every instrument from her hand. She looked at Cecily once, briefly, and something passed between them that was not the expression either of them would have chosen to be observed making. Then Lady Dorothea stepped back from the door and allowed Eleanor to enter the house her father had built. Mrs. Penny came forward the moment Eleanor was inside. She did not say anything immediately. She simply took Eleanor's hands in both of hers and held them the grip of someone who has been holding something for a long time and is finally permitted to put it down. "Your room," Mrs. Penny said, when she could speak. "I kept your room." "Exactly. The staircase was the same staircase. The landing was the same landing. The door to Eleanor's room was the same door, with the same small crack in the paint above the hinge that her father had always meant to see to and never had. The room inside was, as she had left it, the narrow bed and the writing table and the bookshelves with their particular order of things, the arrangement she had made at 12 and refined at 16, and never changed because she had never needed to. The window faced the garden, and the garden was February bare. And the light through the glass was the particular quality of February afternoon light that she had looked at through this window her entire life. On the windowsill, folded in a square of clean muslin, were her mother's silk slippers. She stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she went to the windowsill and picked them up and sat down on the edge of the bed and held them. The embroidery was pale blue and gold, her mother's initials worked into the toe of each one, the stitching delicate enough that you had to look at it twice to be certain of the letters. She had looked at it thousands of times. She had not looked at it for 13 months. She heard steps on the stair unhurried and knew them without looking up. Marcus stopped at the open door. He did not come in. He stood in the doorway with the quality of stillness that was one of the first things she had noticed about him, and he looked at her sitting on the bed with her mother's slippers in her hands, and he did not say anything, because there was nothing useful to say, and he was a man who did not speak when there was nothing useful to say. She looked up at him. "She kept them," Eleanor said. She did not mean Lady Dorothea. "Yes," he said. She turned the slippers in her hands. The silk was a little faded where the light had reached it. Mrs. Penny had wrapped them carefully. The embroidery was intact. "I left them on the windowsill," Eleanor said. "I could not fit them in the case. I thought they were gone." "Things that are kept carefully can come back," Marcus said. He said it the way he said things when he was talking about more than one thing. Plain on the surface and heavier beneath. She had learned this about him over 6 months of conversation. She had learned quite a lot about him over 6 months of conversation, and she thought he had learned a corresponding amount about her, and she was aware that this was not nothing, that in the language of the world they both inhabited, this particular quantity of mutual attention was a statement whether or not either of them had intended it as one. She set the slippers on the windowsill beside her and stood. The window was open an inch at the top, because Mrs. Carrot. Penny always left it an inch, knowing Eleanor preferred the air, and the cold that came through was February cold, the thaws cold, the cold of ice releasing rather than setting. Outside the elms were bare still, but there was a quality in the light that suggested they would not be bare much longer. Marcus had moved slightly into the room. He stood at the writing table, not touching anything, his hat in his hand. She crossed to the window. They were perhaps 3 feet apart, which was in the language of 1717, a very small distance, and they both understood this. "I should like," he said carefully, "to call on you. Properly. When you are settled." Eleanor looked at him. She was aware of his hand, the one not holding the hat which was at his side, and very still. The stillness of something that is making a deliberate choice not to move. "I am settled," she said. The light through the glass was warm despite the chill it carried. It lay across the windowsill, across her mother's slippers, across the edge of Marcus's coat, where he stood near the table. And it had the quality that good February light sometimes achieves, the quality of something ending without loss, the frost gone, and the bare ground patient, and the first suggestion of what the ground intends to do next. His hand moved, not far, not across the distance between them, just from its place at his side to the sill beside hers, close but not quite touching. A hand placed near another hand, the way a question is placed near, an answer that has not quite yet been spoken. She looked at his hand. She looked at the slippers on the sill beside it. She looked at the garden below, bare and familiar, and hers. She placed her hand on the sill. They were not quite touching. The distance was small enough that the warmth of his hand reached her, or perhaps she imagined it. Or perhaps in the world she was learning to inhabit again. It did not matter which. Outside, a finch landed in the nearer elm and sang once and was still. Eleanor Ashby was home. If her story has stayed with you, I would be glad to know what you found in it. A comment, a like, a subscription, so you do not miss what comes next. Thank you for staying until the end.